You are listening to the Unusually Well-Informed podcast.
Welcome to the Unusually Well-Informed podcast. I'm your host, Tim Hampton. My unusually well-informed guest today is Kerry Goyette. Kerry is the founder and president of Aperio Consulting Group. Aperio uses workplace analytics and research-based strategies to build high-performance teams. Kerry is an international speaker with a popular TEDx talk titled, "Stop Trying to Motivate Your Employees." Today, Kerry and I are discussing her book, The Non-Obvious Guide to Emotional Intelligence. We will also explore Aperio's intriguing research on the use of machine learning to help angel investors make more accurate, profitable decisions. Kerry, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Tim. I'm excited to be here.
It's my pleasure. Thank you. So your book is titled The Non-Obvious Guide to Emotional Intelligence. One of the key points in the book that struck me as non-obvious is that EQ is not just about understanding ourselves, but also the motivation and reactions of others. How can a leader use this understanding?
Yeah, it's actually incredibly useful and practical for leaders because I think, in the past, we've been talking about emotional intelligence, for I think since Daniel Goleman coined the phrase a few decades ago, but, we've always thought about it in the terms of ourself. What does that mean for us? I need to be self-aware. I need to understand my emotions and, what I'm bringing to, let's say, a meeting that I'm getting ready to walk into. And that's really one aspect, but we really need to consider, two other aspects that I think play a vital role, which prompted me to actually write the book. And that's, as you said, relationships, those people that we interact with on a daily basis and their motivations, how do they impact us? And then also the environment, what's going on in our environment, what goals and objectives do we need to hit? Like what are the market trends? What's really challenging right now with, technology advancing and we're in this knowledge era. So when you kind of take in those components, you've got the people factor and all those people around me and their unique motivations and the environment, which sometimes is not friendly, as I think we all have experienced. How do we as humans, how do we monitor ourselves? How do we manage ourselves in a way that we can make an intelligent use of our emotions so that we can make better decisions? And that's really, when you think about leaders, it's really pretty simple. I love kind of breaking behavior down pretty simple, but really a leader is the sum total of the decisions they make. And so when we think about all those micro decisions we're making in a day, all the decisions that are impacting our people, it really does matter. And emotional intelligence is critical since we know that most decisions in our brain are made in the emotional centers of our brain.
Yeah, that reminds me of that expression. I don't know exactly how it goes, but it's people may forget what you did, but they'll never forget how you made them feel.
Exactly.
There's a scene in Mad Men. I don't know if you watched that show.
I have not. No.
No? Okay.
Heard lots about it.
Well, yeah, you've heard lots about it. And you probably know that the main character is Don Draper, and he's an ad exec. And he's confronted by a team member. This may resonate with you. She's asking for more recognition, and he responds to say, "That's what the money's for." And so that seems like a good example of emotional deprivation in the workplace. What are the possible impacts that could flow from that?
Yeah, I mean, culture, a lot of people want to spend a lot of money to identify, what their culture is, or how would you define our culture? But it really, honestly, it's simply just, what does it feel like to work here? And so there are serious implications for that, because when we create environments where people can thrive, we've been able to measure that productivity goes up when we're able to tap into their motivation. So I disagree completely with the paycheck. That's what I pay you for. That is, I'm not saying that our pay doesn't matter. It does to a certain degree. But after that, it really doesn't tap into our intrinsic motivation. But when you tap into people's intrinsic motivation, I tell you what, I've worked with really good leaders, and their people will just walk through walls for them. They will stay late. They will work hard. They will do whatever it takes because they feel like their leader has their back. that they trust them, and that they validate them for more than just, the work that they do, for more than just that paycheck. So I will tell you, if you want a culture of people that will just really band behind you, and in this day and age, we kind of all need that. We certainly all could use that. Leadership has just gotten harder. It's gotten much more complex. And so if we don't kind of leverage our people, I will tell you, it will make leadership seem that much harder.
Yeah, completely agree. And that, let's talk about what the opposite looks like. What are the signs of emotional dysfunction in the workplace?
Yeah. I've got a great example. I was working with a company, and they had a brilliant leader, super smart guy, 2 degrees from a very, it was from an Ivy League institution, just brilliant guy. Probably one of the most brilliant people I've ever been in the same room with, like that incredibly smart, just almost intimidating. And he was so incredibly smart, but he really lacked emotional intelligence. And so he was leading one of the biggest departments in that company, one of the most critical operational function areas in that company. And what happened is, that as he was recruiting people in, they got to be part of his leadership. He created a certain microculture around him, which was really predicated on fear. Do what I say, and I'm smarter than you, and so you better respect me. And so he kind of he tried to lead from command and control. And, back in the 80s and 90s, when we were all big on Lean and Six Sigma, and we had a huge talent pool, a line of people walking, that, would be willing to work for our company, that kind of leadership could work. Not that it was ideal, but it could work. But in this environment where the talent pool is much more scarce, and it's hard to find good people, that type of leadership just doesn't work. And so what happened was the company was having a hard time recruiting and retaining these really good engineers because they didn't want to work for him. And he just created a culture where they didn't feel like they were learning. They felt like he had them under their thumb. And so people just started leaving in droves. And finally, the CEO said he's brilliant and he's brought a lot technically to the company. But the CEO finally just said he's become an economic liability. And I thought, wow.
Yeah, that
well
is,
said.
that is amazing. I wanted to pick up on something you said, because I am curious about Six Sigma. I don't really know exactly what it means, but my understanding is it's about driving out waste and errors and that kind of thing.
Right.
And it strikes me, I see some rhetoric surrounding it, and it's really, it to some extent, it's fallen out of favor because it's about creating one perfect process. And I think maybe what you're getting at is the idea that things are changing so fast, you need people to be engaged.
Right.
And so it's not about finding the perfect way. It's about collectively finding a better way all the time.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. I mean, what the environment right now is really calling for is for people to be adaptable, because, again, back in the Lean and Six Sigma day, and I'm not knocking it. I think it's great for trying to drive efficiencies with processes. But the problem is a lot of our organizations are not, manufacturing companies making the same widget day in and day out. And, for that environment, it works great. But we're in a knowledge era. Things are changing really quickly. And we're working with employees that know a heck of a lot more than we do about certain things like technology and other aspects. And so that type of management style just doesn't work in this environment. And so as leaders, we have to adapt. And then as employees, we've got to really be training them on emotional intelligence and adaptability, because we're in a real critical stage right now where organizations are frantically trying to upskill their employees. They're finding that, technology is really advanced, which is great. There's an upside to that. The downside is like, oh, shoot, there's always the human element. And so whether it was in the 80s and 90s, it was Lean and Six Sigma, now it's, blockchain, data analytics, and AI. Either way, there's always the human in the equation that I think people kind of always forget about until like it becomes an afterthought, like, oh, shoot, like we're not getting the results that we need. We need to really work with the human involved. And same thing now, it's just requiring something different. It's requiring a lot of adaptability. We're requiring people to constantly learn and upskill. And that's very different than just running rote and routine processes.
One of the possible risks and maybe misinterpretations that people make when they hear about let's improve our emotional intelligence is that it's going to get touchy-feely. And so how do you draw a line between connecting with people on your team and being too personal? How do you know you're going too far with that?
Yeah. Well, and I'm a clinical therapist by training. So back before I got into focusing on organizations, I did a lot of therapy. But I will say, I think that is a misconception about emotional intelligence. And even the word empathy, I think it's taken way too far. It really is about perspective taking. And so I think when we're talking about emotional intelligence, we have to understand that we're not talking about touchy-feely emotions. We're actually talking about two systems in the brain. We have the thinking system that is very smart, but it's slow to run. It takes a lot of energy and resources. That's, mostly coming from the prefrontal cortex. I mean, the brain is really complex, so I'm simplifying it, but pretty much that's that's the prefrontal cortex and where we think. But then there's the automatic, unconscious part of our brain that just runs like lightning. It takes very little energy and resources. And that's the emotional centers of our brain. So it's not just about like talking about our feelings or like, hey, like, let me like kind of pull up a couch and tell you everything. It really is just about understanding that everybody has these emotional centers of our brain and that we make decisions very emotionally. So how can we create an environment where people feel psychologically safe? It doesn't mean doing therapy. It doesn't mean I need to know how you feel about everything. But how can we just respect and create the kind of environment where people can challenge, where people can bring their ideas forward and not feel like they're, being shut down or made fun of? It is really more about that. I actually work with a lot of, engineers and technical people that they're always like, please don't come in with the but. And I'm a perfect fit for that because I'm very science-based. And so it's not a lot of like touchy-feely. It's really about, no, let's create the conditions where the brain can thrive. That's really all we're looking for.
So certainly, this is a challenging time for anybody's brain to thrive because we're all in fight or flight a little bit because of COVID.
Right.
How should leaders respond to what's going on with that?
Number one, with grace. We're all at our worst right now. We all feel overwhelmed. And again, it's luckily, things are we're starting to come out of it with the vaccine rollout, but still people are just kind of have a hangover from this entire year. So I would say, number one, have grace, understand that people are not working at their best. They're not going to collaborate as effectively. And when we're under stress, I mean, that's the problem with chronic stress is what it does to our thinking. It really narrows our focus. And it drops our IQ sometimes by up as much as 75%. So that can bring us down to roughly an 8-year-old. So when we say why do we have all these drama and whatnot? I feel like I'm managing middle schoolers. Well, it's just because that's what we revert back to.
Sure.
And so I would say, number one, have some grace. And number two, since a lot of people are still virtual and they're kind of, feeling the stress and the burnout of the pandemic, the best thing you can do right now is just create clarity for them. So consistently priority setting, keeping them on task, because when they feel overwhelmed, they have a hard time. All they see are 50 million tasks. So as a leader, it sounds very simple, but I will tell you, leaders they're challenged right now too. I mean, they're under stress, but they're kind of forgetting that we just be clear, set 3. What are the 3 most important priorities that we need to work on this week? And what that does is 3, okay, whoo, I can focus and okay, I'm clear. I need to get those things done. And what you're doing is you're just giving them the opportunity and providing some focus for them. And making it feel like it's not as hard if we're kind of narrowing it down to what are the top 3. And we're coming alongside to say, hey, let me know, what do you need? What can I do to help and support? So coming along with the help and support is key.
So one of the challenges is I guess we've kind of touched on it already, because the one thing that's different about COVID is we're all at home. And the fear, which is making me into an 8-year-old. I get that. Or did you say grade 8? Give me that at least. But one of the particular challenges is, and you've been incredibly gracious. I feel like we're getting along great, but we're doing it through Zoom, and we're all doing it through Zoom these days. And there's so many social cues that are missing.
Yes.
What should organizations do about that? Is there some extra effort that we can make for one another to make each other feel welcome or engaged or valued?
Yeah. Yeah. I think if we're on Zoom, one thing is just be cognizant of of scheduling back-to-back Zooms. We need a break. Our brain has to work harder. That's why after a full day of Zooms, we've all kind of felt it. It's like, oh, like, because I am like, if I'm in person, I can more easily read your facial expressions. I can more easily pick up on social cues. But when it's 2D, I'm having to, like, you can even see, like, I will lean in because I have to work a little harder to try to read emotions. And so that's what, it's just harder for the brain. And so I would say, make sure that you're allowing for time for deep work. So making sure that no meetings are scheduled, for half a day on Wednesdays. Our deep work day is on Wednesdays. So I think there's some things that you can do. And I think also create some meetings that are just for relationship building. So if it's a virtual happy hour, or if it's just, hey, we're going to work asynchronously, but we're going to have our Zoom up and we're going to kind of chat as we do it. That actually just shifts the brain from like, oh, this is a meeting and I have to sit here, to, okay, I'm going to work. And then I can just like pop in with like, hey, what do you think about this? And that is what's missing when we were all together. It was so easy to kind of do the pop in, or we could say, hey, what about this? But unfortunately, we're not kind of getting that need met. And a lot of times we won't ask those like little questions because we feel like it's not worthy of an email or a Slack message. And so if we just have some kind of more informal Zoom time, we have the opportunity to kind of ask some of those more informal, small questions.
Yeah, I like that a lot. I'm first of all, I'm really grateful for that idea of no meeting Wednesday. I'm quoting you the whole day. I'm going to bring it up at work. But I really like the idea of what happens in Zoom is, because you're so compartmentalized, it's easy to say, okay, let's just get through the agenda. Kerry, go. Tim, go. And then we're done. Right. Whereas if we all came a couple of minutes early, we'd be sitting back. How was the game? How's the weather? You don't get that in Zoom. So if we just padded the meeting just a little bit so that we could, right, talk about how things are going, I think that's a great suggestion.
Yeah. And my communications director, Allison, is awesome at this, but she will often start it like with music, like a funny video or music. And it just it's just like, oh, it's a little bit unexpected because you're not used to that. And it's just like, okay. And then we all kind of smile and laugh. And then that kind of gets that relationship building going. And again, it doesn't have to be for long, but it really sets the tone.
Yeah. So coming back to more general times, when hiring, there's a tendency to hire people who look like us, sound like us, think like us. Maybe it's, legitimate. It's like cultural unity. We can all work together easily, but we also have an obligation, and there's a strategic advantage to having diversity in a team. How do you correct for that when you go about hiring?
Yeah. Yeah. It's a hard one because, again, if you have a human brain, you're biased, and it's exactly as you said, we just hire ourselves over and over again. Because it feels familiar, it feels good. Oh, I like that person. And really, that's the emotional centers of our brain kicking in. And really what we're asking is, what would it be like to hang out with this person? Could I go grab a beer with this person on a Friday night? Or could I, drive with them, to Denver, to the mountains? And would I like that?
And you hear that as advice on how to choose people.
Right. But it's actually terrible advice because all you're going to do is hire yourself.
Yeah.
And so you really need to have an objective process in there. And so we've actually worked with clients and developed processes for them. But you really need to kind of rely on the best practices in structured behavioral interviews, doing a resume screen, really thinking about, what do I need in this role? I think a lot of times people think, oh, well, I have to have a college degree. Well, do you really? Like sales, I've pushed people, do you really? What if you found a rock star that didn't have a college degree? Right. And so really consider, what are the must-haves? And then there are a lot of selection tools out there, assessments, artificial intelligence that can help with that. It's one piece. I will just say, not all of them are created equal. So do your homework and do your research. We vet a ton. So feel free to reach out to our firm. We vet a lot of different assessment tools and whether or not they're EEOC compliant. But that's another way that you can take a more objective approach to it. And when you do that, the reality is we all think we want to hire people that we like. But the problem is when they don't perform, all of a sudden we don't like them anymore.
Yes.
And but if we're like, I don't know if I'd want to hang out with them on a weekend, but then they're a rock star and they're doing, a killer job in their role. All of a sudden you're like, oh, thank you.
I love this candidate.
I love this person.
Sure. Yeah.
And so I think that's really the key. We really have to look at what defines success in the role and start with the role first. When you start with people, you just fall in love with people and then you'll be biased. But start with the role first. What really is truly needed for this role, for this job? What's a good fit for our culture? And then start looking at candidates and have an objective approach. And I always recommend having a panel that interviews, just because, again, we're inherently biased. Right. And so if we can get a diverse panel that will help mitigate that bias.
Do you find that, now, of course, you may have a bias because of who you see on a daily basis, but do you think people are getting more or less emotionally intelligent over time? Do you think the lessons are getting through?
That's a really good question. Daniel Goleman actually measures that, and he has found that over the past 3 decades, emotional intelligence has fallen, but it's fallen at the same rate that IQ has risen. So we're getting smarter, but we're getting less wise.
Wow.
I always say there's smart and then there's wisdom, and the wisdom comes from the emotional intelligence.
Do you think it's a generational thing?
Yeah, I think, it's hard to simplify it down to a few things, but I will say a few things that researchers have observed that has contributed to it is one of which the parenting model shifted. And so we became very concerned about our kids' self-esteem. And I think the intentions were really good. So I'm not knocking, parenting is one of the hardest things you can do. I have 3 kids, so I totally understand. So I'm not knocking that parenting, but I think what we didn't expect were the unintended consequences was how we build resilience and build self-esteem and confidence is actually through failure. So I think we took, everybody got a trophy. We didn't want anybody to feel, like they were in a competitive environment. The problem is that's not how the real world is set up. And so if it was great, but since it's not, it poses a lot of challenges. So we were monitoring and assessing people entering the workforce, and their confidence and self-esteem was significantly lower than other generations. And so I think the parenting model shifted. And so we started coddling, which dropped it. And on top of it, the environment shifted and it's gotten much more demanding. It's challenging. Things are, change has always been constant. I don't want to act like, because things are changing. The problem is it's things are shifting at a much faster pace. And so it's the pace of change that is really challenging for our brains, and our brains are having a hard time keeping up. So it's both, some of the, just how we shifted as a society and how we viewed parenting, that played a part. The environment played a part. It was kind of like just a perfect storm. So unfortunately, emotional intelligence has dropped. And that's why we're seeing a lot more depression and anxiety, partly because, we're getting better at diagnosing it, but partly too, we're just having a hard time keeping up with and being resilient. And on top of that, our brains are social, we're social creatures. And so you add social media to that. Yeah. I'm not against social media necessarily, but it can do a lot of damage if we're not careful. And so, if we're called out or bullied on social media, that's completely amplified to how it was like when I was in high school. And if somebody just walked by me and shoved me or called me a name, it was just me and a few people around that saw it. But social media, it's, 1,000 of your closest friends that see it. So there are multiple contributors to it.
Is email part of it? Because people might be more barbed, or it might feel more barbed in an email than it would in person?
Yeah. And both email, social media, 93% of communication is nonverbal. And so that's a real issue. when there's a discrepancy. And so like, if I read an email and I don't get to see the body language behind it, I'm always going to interpret it more negative than what it is. And two, when we're behind social media or an email, we're not face to face, and we are willing to say things that we would not say to people's faces. And so we can be a lot more harsh. We can, again, say things that are maybe not nice or cruel even. And I think, I always just I'm fascinated by that. Like, would you say that to that person's face? And if the answer is no, then why are you saying it there? But we feel more protected. And so I think we are just kind of throwing things out there that are not
it's
helpful.
almost like road rage.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
One of the things you bring up in your book that relates to the fact there's so much change going on is VUCA.
Mm-hmm.
What is, which I love that phrase. What is VUCA, and what is the impact, and what can we do about it?
Yeah. So VUCA is a term that actually the US military coined in the late 1990s because they saw that the environment was shifting. And so the business world kind of picked it up. But it's an acronym that stands for volatility, uncertainty, complexity, and ambiguity. And so VUCA is just a great terminology to say, like, we are in a disruptive environment. And the brain always views change or a disruptive environment with an assessment of threat. And so again, that's the other thing, about emotional intelligence is we're kind of going into this environment of this VUCA environment. Our brain assesses it as a threat. Our focus narrows, and then that's where we make suboptimal decisions. It's kind of like when, after 9/11, what did we do? That was the safest time to fly, but what does everybody do? They get in their cars, which is, much more, you're much more likely to be in an accident in a car. Or after the market crash, that's the best time to buy stocks. But what do we do? We sell. And so when we experience that assessment of threat, that's where the brain is likely to make suboptimal decisions. And the reality is we're in a business environment. And, if I'm out in the woods, think back to our ancestors, and, if there's a bear and it's coming at me, going into fight or flight response is exactly what I need to do to deal with that physical threat.
Right.
But in a complex business environment, what researchers and neuroscientists have proven is that when we experience a social threat, for instance, if my idea is shut down in a meeting, I experience it the same way with the same pain centers lighting up as I do a physical threat. And so that puts us into fight or flight. And the problem is going into fight or flight for a complex business problem is not usually the best way. And so that's where I say emotions are data. They're data that we need to be aware of, and it can be a signal, but they are not directives. Right. And so the more that I can get from the emotional centers of my brain to the thinking part and analyze, okay, I feel threatened. I feel a sense of threat. How do I want to respond? Because we're still humans and we have agency. And so we get to choose how we respond. But that takes a lot of self-awareness. It takes a lot of perspective taking of the situation to do that. And that's not easy to do.
No. Coming back to the maybe it's not so much that EQ is falling as much as it looks different from generation to generation. In your book, you pointed out that one of the unique characteristics of our time is that we have multiple generations working together. I mean, at most in the old days, it might have been one or two because it's backbreaking work and you're out of there in 20 years.
Right.
But now people are lasting in their job for 50 years if they want.
Mm-hmm.
So what challenges and what opportunities does that create?
Yeah, it's interesting. There are a lot of challenges because we've got 5 generations in the workplace. And so it just creates, like I said, leadership has never been harder than it is now. And one of the reasons is we've got these 5 generations. And so, you've got the older generation, the baby boomers that are now exiting the workforce, but you still have some in there. A lot of them are managers and leaders. And the problem is when they leave, a lot of knowledge, a lot of historical context is walking out the door with them. And so then on top of that, then you've got Gen Zers, the young ones coming into the workforce right now, and they're technically savvy, they're digital natives. And so really what we've been working with organizations on is you really need to pair the two. If we can pair the older generation so that we can get out of their brain a lot of that, just the experience that they have, the historical knowledge, and transfer that to the younger generation. And 2, if the younger generation can help mentor the older generations on being more tech savvy, and whatnot. It's actually a really good pairing. And when we've done that, both generations, all the generations seem to be working really well together, but that takes intentionality. It's not going to happen on its own. And then you've got the millennials who are getting older now. There was a lot of flack about millennials.
Don't tell them that.
I know. But they're now, the challenge for millennials right now is because baby boomers are exiting the workforce. And then we've got Gen Xers, that's my generation.
That's
we're
me.
the smallest generational cohort. So we're occupying a lot of the leadership positions, but there just aren't enough of us. So millennials are getting thrust into leadership positions before they're either emotionally, psychologically, or even technically ready. And so I'm seeing a lot of millennials kind of crash and burn because they think they're ready. They want it. They're very ambitious, and they have this idea. They can be idealistic at times, and so they get in there and they think they're ready for it. And they're really not. I've had several millennial leaders that have ended up leaving their jobs saying, I don't ever want to be a leader again. And they go back. But you can't, it's hard to do that in the company that you came from, because that's kind of like admitting that I failed. So it's unfortunate, but a lot of companies are promoting these millennials because they really want it and because there's a real need, but then they're not surviving in that, and then they just leave. So they're losing a lot of really good talent.
So it's not solely related to millennials, of course, but what you're talking about reminds me of, I don't know if you've heard of this idea, the Peter Principle.
Yes. Uh-huh.
Yeah.
Yep.
So correct me if I'm wrong, but basically the idea of the Peter Principle is that people get promoted to the point of incompetence. So You're great at your job, do the next one up the rung.
Right.
And as soon as you get to one where you're not any good, you kind of languish there.
Right.
What can organizations and individuals do to avoid that?
Yeah, there needs to be a little bit of a stepping stone. Or as I say, if you're going to go ahead and promote them into a leadership position, you better equip them with mentors, put them in classes. I mean, it's a totally different skill set. Everybody thinks like, oh, they were an A player. They were the best at doing X. But doing X and being a leader are two different skills. So that's exactly what they're doing. They're highly competent, but then they promote them to a level of incompetence, but they're not supporting them. And, and I'll knock on my generation, Gen Xers, we're not the best at developing people. We're just kind of like, do it, like sink or swim. Cause that's kind of how we had to learn.
We were the latchkey kids, of course.
Exactly. So we're like, sink or swim. So we're not great at developing people, but I will say millennials, I give them credit. They're hard workers. And they really learn quickly if we invest in them. So I would say you need to have almost like an emerging leaders cohort, where if you've got some of those A players that you're thinking about putting into a leadership position, then start upskilling them, right away and get them ready for leadership and prepare them. I just think it's unfair what we're doing. I mean, it's really, and I get passionate about this because it's really an issue. I had one company. They put a 32-year-old who had never managed a day in his life in charge of the biggest department in their company. And he started after a while coming to work drunk. Mm-hmm. And I just said, look at what you are doing. You've put him in such a big, highly visible, a big responsibility before he was ready. You didn't equip him. You didn't come alongside him. And now he's coping without, like that. I mean, that's an issue. And leadership is hard. People don't realize. That's why I work with leaders. It's easy to, kind of throw stones at them and critique them. But if you've been a manager for a day, you'll know it's like when you have to lead other human beings, it's one of the hardest things you will ever do.
Just to switch gears a little bit, you wrote a white paper titled Strategic Agility. Uh-huh. So can we talk about that a little bit? What is strategic agility and how does that differ from traditional strategic planning?
Yeah, that's a great question. So we jumped into about 2 years ago. We saw, again, we were watching trends. We saw that we were getting ready to go into a very disruptive environment. And, then the pandemic happened, that just accelerated things. But we started studying this concept a couple years ago. And, simply because we've had a lot of leaders ask, I really want to improve on strategic thinking. And then we were also looking at an organizational level. What do organizations need to be prepared for? And we realized it really is centered around this strategic agility, which is how effectively can the senior team adapt to the environment and stay relevant. And so it sounds really easy, but it's actually incredibly
it's everything.
It is.
Yeah.
It is. It really encapsulates everything. And so it's different than strategic planning in the sense of it's much more like divergent in thinking. There's an emotional intelligence component to it. Strategic planning is more convergent, and it's more kind of putting it down into tactics. A lot of companies actually, spend a lot of time on a strategic plan, but very few are what we would consider strategically agile. It's very different. It's one thing to create a plan, but most people create a plan and then it sits there for the rest of the year collecting dust, even though they spent a month working on it. But yeah, actually, focusing on it and executing on it are two different things. And so it has a component of strategic thinking. There's a strategic sensitivity to it. I have to be able to predict and stay aware of the market. That's the environmental piece of emotional intelligence. Am I aware and am I external enough that I can detect and even start to forecast, have some foresight? And that's where the prediction piece comes in. Do I have enough knowledge that I can start to see patterns and trends and start to be able to craft a strategy and a plan that I can execute before it actually hits? It's one thing. Most organizations were very reactive, but when you look at the research and you look at those organizations that are strategically agile, they outperform considerably. And I think that, in this disruptive environment, there's going to be a bigger disparity. We're going to have the top strategically agile organizations that are really going to pull from the pack, and those that are just status quo where they thought they could just limp along are actually going to fall behind. And so there's that strategic sensitivity. There's the focus piece, like what are we eliminating? That's one of the hardest things for humans to do, is to get rid of something or eliminate things that aren't working. And that's simply because there are people behind it. There's, agendas behind it. There's plans and teams behind those initiatives. So it's really hard to kill an initiative. Sounds good in theory, but much harder. So there are just a lot of kind of emotional intelligence-y competencies wrapped up into strategic agility, which makes it challenging.
So there's so much to that answer. Thank you for that. One thread I'd like to pull on is in that tension between agility and having like a strategic plan and having strategic agility. One thing is, first of all, there's so much there. There's one thing is the idea of not trying to pursue every idea you've ever had. That really there needs to be a mission, and everything else is subordinate to that.
Right.
But even companies that do that well, they have the challenge of there are things that contribute to the mission, and when you say lean, you connect that to Six Sigma, which is kind of from lean manufacturing, I think. But lean startup is all about try something. If it doesn't work, kill it. Try something else. If it doesn't work, kill it. So that divergent, convergent. My question is, how do you deal with the risk of people killing things too soon? Because that, in the name of strategic agility, you might have people saying, okay, stop that, do something else. And they become flighty. They ricochet too much.
Yeah. And that's where I would say that they have impulse. That's what I call like an impulsive organization where we're flighty. I've got, I've worked with one organization like that, and the CEO was really flighty, just killing things left and right. And so on the other end of the spectrum, though, you've got people that are just, full steam ahead. We're staying on course no matter what, and they can get complacent. So I think the key is, and again, it's not easy. I mean, this is why leadership is tough, but it's really about being focused and flexible. Mm-hmm. So you have to be flexible enough, but you have to have a focused mission. Where are we headed? We have to have a really good, I always tell people, look 10 years out, you need to know where are we headed in 10 years, not because we're fortune tellers and we can predict the future, because we can't. A lot of people are like, 10 years is too far out. No, actually 10 years is the right amount to look at, because it informs you what you need to be doing today. And it's far enough out that we know, like if you look 10 years out, that's why we shifted about 2 years ago, because we looked 10 years out and we knew AI is here to stay. I mean, it's just going to come in full force. Things are going to be automated. Robots are coming. I mean, like those things are coming. So then the question is, how does that inform our decisions today? What capabilities do we need to be building up? And so I think the focus part is staying focused on your strategy, having a really good strategy, but flexible in the sense of how we get there.
Right.
And that's kind of the balance, is focused on the strategy and where we're going, but we have to stay highly flexible in how we get there.
So I love all of that. So let me set aside one piece, which is your AI work, because I do want to talk about that. That's exciting stuff. But before we leave the subject of strategic agility and having having focus on a mission, are there companies out there, and you're not allowed to name ones you've helped, are there companies out there you admire for their ability to be both agile and stick to a mission?
Yeah, let me think about that. I would say Tesla is one of them. I think, it's just so interesting to look at Elon Musk, and, people either love him or hate him. It was interesting to watch his Saturday Night Live bit and how much controversy that brought on. But
I was afraid to watch.
Yeah, I would say one thing, he's been very true to his mission. And I think he's just always wanted to push the bounds. And even when everybody else, there were investors that were like, this is crazy, why would I invest in that? So I would say he's one that's been very focused on the mission, but very flexible in how he gets there. And he's willing to kind of take on crazy ideas and fail, and, look at the rockets he's blown up. Part of that is you have to be okay with failure, and that's not easy. It's not easy for leaders to do.
No. So one other point about organizations is, how do you used a phrase, I think it was in your strategic agility paper, you used the phrase collective intuition, which I thought was a beautiful phrase, a useful thing to aim for. But how do you build that in an organization?
Yeah. It's an interesting one, because you kind of think of it as, okay, that sounds like collaboration, but it's actually, it's got an element of that, but it's slightly different. And I would say that's where it's really important that we create psychological safety within our organization, because collective commitment is really about how do we get the collective group committed to where we're going. And that means we have to have hard conversations. We have to have a lot of task conflict, because within every organization, there's going to be just inherent tensions, like between sales and operations. And that's natural. That's, it's a good that it should be there, but how do we manage those? And so that collective commitment is kind of like collaboration on steroids, but it's about, every department and leader educating each other, so that they kind of understand, okay, here's what I'm dealing with. Here's the challenges I'm facing. Here's kind of what we're doing. And that then helps inform the other leader who has interdependencies with each department. And so there's a big component that I think people miss on. We have to really educate one another on only what's in our brain, what we know. So there's an education component to it. And there's a part of, we have to stay focused on the mission. And I think when we do that and we're able to have that task conflict, while having psychological safety, so that we're not having relational conflict, we're much more better suited to have that collective commitment to drive the organization forward. We're now committed, and we have each other's back because we better understand it. A lot of leaders that I work with struggle. They get so protective, and they protect what they know, and they don't share like they should. And part of that, knowledge is power. And so we really have to create the conditions where we can just say, hey, let's put it all out on the table. We're all here for the same mission. So let's put it all on the table, have really good debate, perspective taking, do some education, and then let's stay committed to what we decide going forward.
So that's really useful. And I want to dwell on that just a little bit, because I do manage a team, and I would like to try and build this idea. When I read collective intuition, the phrase, my mind went to the idea of a hockey team knowing where each other are, and then also what the other team's going to do.
Exactly. Because when you start to the more you know about what other people are doing, now you're like, okay, I get it. Like, I know where you're going to be. Oh, he's going to come up this side, of the ice rink. And so you're exactly right. So we start to, what people don't understand is that knowledge, that work that we're doing as a collective group, it builds in that intuition. So I'm going to know exactly what that other leader is going to need.
Yeah.
I'm going to be like, oh, yep, I know exactly what he's going to need because I'm moving this forward. So I'm going to be, proactive and make sure to get her exactly what she needs.
So let's get into Aperio a little bit and talk about your company, Aperio, the one you founded. What processes does your company follow to help organizations build high performance teams? I mean, we've talked about the goals somewhat and what the teams can do for themselves, but when you're engaged by a company, what do you do? What are your steps?
Yeah. We do have processes when working with companies. So usually, not that every single engagement follows the same process, but usually there's a diagnostic phase. So it's going in and diagnosing kind of the as-is state, what's going on. So if an organization hires us to solve a problem, let's say they've got an issue, we're trying to hit this, we're struggling, we're not able to do that. Or it can be the other side, like, hey, we're doing fine, but we're really trying, like we want to get to that.
We want to be number one.
Exactly. We want to be number one. Then I'm a certified forensic interviewer. And what I did realize about, kind of my past life of doing that has been actually really a value add for businesses because I know how to interview. I know how to ask a lot of questions. And so I go in and do a diagnostic phase and try to get at like what is going on. And so that is probably one of the most critical phases because if I can get to my goal with that is how do we get to the root cause? Because almost 99% of the time leaders hire me in and they say, okay, here's what the issue is. But it's really just a symptom. It's not the root issue. So my job is to really go in and figure out what is the root issue? What is the root cause of the problem or the symptom that they're experiencing right now? And then we design solutions to basically fix that or to get them to that next level of growth.
Just out of curiosity, what is the definition of forensic? It sounds like it's is it just about finding cause? Is that how you would define it?
Yeah. So I used to interview perpetrators and victims. And it was, I had to do it the training was very intensive, but you have to do it in a way that can be held up in a court of law. So it's interviewed and taped and often used in the court of law. Yeah. And I had to testify. So it's just a very specific way of asking non-biased, unbiased questions and non-leading questions. But you dig and dig and dig. And so that training, actually the training is where I first kind of stumbled upon systems thinking. So that's why, emotional intelligence is, we look at the environment, the people, relationships and ourself. And that was my first exposure early on to, because the training, we got trained by, the police department, the prosecutors, the medical doctors, the sheriff's department. You were trained by every team. And it was so fascinating because I was like, oh, they all were after different information. And so you started to see how we're all after the same thing, but every expert in there was looking for something different. And so it's really helped me in working with organizations. It's kind of the same thing with leaders. Each department, each leader, each function area, they have their own, goals and objectives, and they're always looking at it from their perspective. My job is to look at that, assess it, and see as a whole, why are we having this issue, or why are we not able to move forward? And so it's kind of putting and connecting the dots and putting the pieces together.
I love that. So you founded the company. Why is it called Aperio?
It's Latin and it means to reveal. And I'm all about revealing teams and organizations' potential. Yeah. Less than 20% of us live up to our full potential. So that's where the opportunity is.
Okay. Very good. I like that. So let's get to the fun bit about machine learning. So Aperio has done some research on the use of machine learning to help angel investors make more accurate, profitable decisions. How does it work?
That's a good question.
I need all the trade secrets.
Yeah. So I'll back up just a little bit because I want to kind of give a little bit of context to how we got there. But yeah, it kind of goes back to the disruptive environment. I saw that things were shifting and kind of like just with, Six Sigma, what we talked about earlier, now it's with AI. And I was seeing a lot of companies that were trying to implement it and failing. And so again, it's just a pattern I've seen over and over again. And so I realized that, yeah, there's a human component to this, and we're not thinking about it through the right lens. We're not thinking about artificial intelligence with the human in mind. And so that's where I just decided to make a shift. And I just decided that we really needed to think about combining behavioral science with artificial intelligence. And so it was a hypothesis. I didn't really know where it would go, to be honest. But I thought if we combine those two and keeping the human at the center, we'd have better AI and we'd have better adoption of AI. And so I ended up hiring a data scientist. He has his PhD in electrical engineering and computer science. And he he studied like all types of AI, but his dissertation was on a particular form of AI called explainable AI.
Mm-hmm.
And so it works really well with humans, because just like humans, we often have to show our work. We have to kind of communicate, hey, this is what we did and why we did it.
Yeah.
AI really should do the same. And I think that a lot of people have been very weary of AI just simply because it's a black box. How do we know? We don't know. And, our brains, humans, were meaning-making machines. And so that's why explainable AI works really well. And so we've been kind of working on that concept of how do we get better adoption? Like, how can we create the environment where technology and humans can actually work well together to benefit society, and so to benefit, organizations. And so that's really what our mission has been in kind of going this direction. And so we ended up creating an algorithm that can essentially decode performance, but it keeps the human in the loop. And so it's explainable, but we're also adding in human data. And so let's go to, looking at entrepreneurs, we just asked the question, what part of an entrepreneur's success is made up of them? Just what they bring, their emotional intelligence, their soft skills. And so we asked that question, and we looked at it, and 77% of their success was due to them. And so, again, you can argue a lot of things, there are a lot of, there's market timing, all of that. We're not arguing that doesn't exist, but there's such a strong component of what the entrepreneur brings that if they have all the right stuff, they probably will predict the market. They probably are going to do their due diligence. So, they're somewhat interrelated, but what's really interesting and I think exciting about this is, we have a real need for innovation and, just for our, culturally, I'm just a huge fan of innovation and small startups. And so what we want to do is to take this research and figure out how can we better set entrepreneurs up for success, and how can we start to invest in those entrepreneurs that are underrepresented. So like females and those communities that are underrepresented by, getting funding from angels or VCs. And so we're super excited about this. We're excited to be combining. I didn't really know what we were going to get into, but, or what we would find, but we're finding that, what computational intelligence or AI brings, it really helps behavioral science in the fact that it can encode far more knowledge. We can look at thousands of people's data. So it can encode far more knowledge and see patterns that, more than one single human can. But what behavioral science has is it has the keys to how do we unlock that? Like, how do we effectively and ethically process that? And how do we keep the human in the driver's seat so that they are driving it and able to see how the AI came to that conclusion? I think that is key. And I think in that situation, if we can figure that out, if we can do that, then it benefits both.
I want to backtrack a little bit. There's a lot there, and I want to keep going with that. But I want to backtrack to a couple of things. So one is Tesla and SpaceX are enormously successful. Mm-hmm. And what made me think about that was when you were saying that there's market timing, there's picking the right segment, but there's also betting on the person who's likely to succeed, and that's 77%. The thing about Elon Musk is the general impression is he's not easy to work for.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So help me unpack his success and then knowing that maybe he's hard to work for. Is it possible? My personal sort of way of trying to square that circle is to say, okay, there are places that are tough to work, but it's almost Darwinian. The people who thrive on that kind of pressure will wind up staying with the company. And as long as they keep thriving, there's no problem. I don't know, like it's almost a counter argument to, or I don't know, because these companies, you don't necessarily know exactly what's going on and what it's exactly like to work for them. But do you have any misgivings about the way he manages and versus his success?
Yeah, I mean, I would say we just have to be careful about drawing correlations where they don't exist. And so I think it's easy to say, like, if you've got a particular leader or CEO who maybe is a tyrant. I mean, people said the same thing about Steve Jobs. But you don't have to be a jerk to be a good leader. And so I don't know that him being hard to work for is what makes him a good leader. I think there are other components. And my hypothesis, just because I've seen this before, is that you can have some of those same ingredients of what makes him successful and also be a very respectful, kind leader, and still be successful. I had one leader, super successful guy, and he was just like the nicest person to work for. And he even said, he goes, I was so, he said, I come from a finance background. He goes, I was all about the numbers. And, I got into the CEO position. It was all about driving it hard. He goes, and I finally came to the realization one day that I was in the people performing business, and I needed to create a culture where people can thrive. And he demonstrated that his results soared after he finally got that. He stopped focusing so much on just the numbers and started creating that kind of culture where people love to work there. And so, yeah, I mean, so that's just where I would say, you just kind of have to be careful about making those jumps. I don't think that's really accurate, because I could also pull a lot of people that are phenomenal leaders and very successful.
So returning to the AI project that you're doing, where the result of it, is it that you're advising investors on who to bet on, or are you sitting down with the people who might be bet on and saying, you'll probably get more investment if you do X? Which way do you use the data?
We've done it both, but it's more the second. It's more the latter. So we're more sitting down with them. So after somebody's decided to invest in them, they really want to pour development into them. And so we're comparing them to the study and saying, okay, here's the areas where you're really strong. You've got these strengths. Here are the areas that you don't match to the benchmark on. And here are ways to build that up. And we also give the investors who are often on their board just some things like, here's how you could see this play out. Here's how you can help and support. The one thing I've been impressed with, when I first got into this, I thought investors were just all about making money. I'm not saying that that's not true. Of course, they're betting. So they are hoping that they get a good investment. But I'm shocked at how much time and attention and mentorship they put into these entrepreneurs. So that actually blew me away. And so that's where I just met with four investors about one particular entrepreneur, and they were like, this is so helpful. I mean, they're like, this was amazing. And they're like, can you work with this entrepreneur? We think that he's got what it takes, and so can you work with him on the areas where he has some opportunity for growth? And so it's just fun to see in that sense. So I would say it's more used for a development aspect. But yes, it certainly can be used for screening.
Is there an element of what gets you here won't get you there, in terms of the pool of people who are able to get the attention of an angel investor may not be the best people to run a large company?
Yeah.
And there are two ways to approach that. One is to say, okay, so take your money, we'll put somebody in charge, or these are the things you need to work on. Which do you think is a more effective strategy? Is it horses for courses, or is it sort of training and orientation?
Well, I mean, it's a little bit of both. I mean, most startup founders, I think, what did I read? I think it was roughly 80% of them are asked to step down or fired at some point. And that's simply because of most entrepreneurs are usually some sort of creative type, not always, but often they tend to be a creative type. What's interesting too, is a lot of them we have found have they had some sort of personal hardship growing up. And so they had to learn alternative strategies to succeed. Which is interesting. But it also kind of equates to their creative. They couldn't succeed like everybody else, so they had to find alternative strategies. And so that type of personality, if you will, is really good for a startup because they're creating and they're trying to get it to go. Once it's gotten success and it's to the point of scaling it up, usually then you want to give it to somebody who's less creative. And more of the mindset of more like process and efficiencies and scale, excuse me, rather than creative. But even a creative, just to get to the point to where they can even step out, they're usually going to need some development at some point.
Right. Mm-hmm. And that is the interesting thing, isn't it? That, we're the only animal that gestates outside the womb. So we've got that, and then we got the other thing. And then, we have to spend the rest of our lives learning more things as we go through new roles. So it's kind of exciting, but it's also kind of daunting. And I think that's why services like yours are valuable, because otherwise, how am I going to learn this stuff? You don't necessarily have somebody with your background who's met with 100 entrepreneurs in the same situation, able to navigate people through that. To return to the AI stuff, what kinds of psychometric traits are you looking at, and what stands out as far as where people are stumbling?
Yeah. Okay. So this is really cool because I didn't know what we were going to find. So when we dug into it, we actually looked at 120 different psychometric traits. So we kind of wanted to cast a broad net, and because we didn't really know, what we would find. So when we think about like introversion or extroversion, some people have said, well, extroverts make better entrepreneurs. The reality is nope, no correlation. You can be an introvert or an extrovert. It doesn't matter. So that's good. As far as, our behavioral style. What came out as the most predictive were what I talk about in my Non-Obvious Guide to Emotional Intelligence book is our derailers. We all have certain derailers that get triggered in times of stress or, times of threat. And so it's the derailers that came out as the most predictive of failure. And if they were able to manage them well, meaning like their derailers were very minimal, it definitely contributed to their success. So there's the other thing that we did with explainable AI, one of the reasons it works so well when you have humans as part of the equation is because it's not asking for a binary, will they be successful? Yes or no. It's actually able to tell you how much of something, what's the optimal amount. So let's take perseverance. One of the critical components of being an entrepreneur is to persevere enough, but not too much. Because if you're rigid and you stick with it and you don't have the ability to pivot, I don't know how many angels and VCs have said they need to be able to pivot. And so that shows up on their perseverance score. So what explainable artificial intelligence does is it tells us the optimal amount. And so what's beautiful about this is every entrepreneur that was successful and the ones that we're predicting that are successful, each of them look different. No two have the same profile, but they do have like an optimal amount in different categories that helps them be successful in what they're doing. But I will say that those derailers are what knock us down every time. And investors will say like, yeah, it's what they do when all of a sudden the vendors don't follow through or something went wrong. What do they do in times of stress? Mm-hmm.
So when you say derailer, then you're talking about how people deal with things not going according to plan?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. One of the most damaging derailer you can have is impulsivity. And so the reason why is how it comes out in entrepreneurship, like you're little and you don't have a name. So you're trying to build something out of nothing. And what we know about brain science is our brain thrives if we're part of a group. So an entrepreneur has a pretty big hill to climb because you're by yourself, first of all.
Mm-hmm.
And now, but I know that I need other people. So that means other partners, other vendors. And so entrepreneurs can get caught up in this fallacy of, oh, I can't share anything because my idea is so brilliant. I don't want anybody to steal it. It is one of the worst mistakes an entrepreneur can make, because the only way you're going to be successful are by the relationships, the partnerships you make. Yeah. And so impulsivity, what it does is it causes them to either burn bridges. I had one entrepreneur and she was burning through vendors. She got herself into lawsuits because that impulsivity, and what it does is it self-sabotages you. And so it comes out in relationships, partners, vendors, lawsuits. And so it was the most predictive of failure.
So that is such an important part. And I have been to some events where they're trying to encourage people to start something up. Right. Mm-hmm. And, if I'd been in a bar when Elon Musk was talking about he's going to build a multi-billion-dollar car company, I wouldn't have been like, here's my money. Right. I mean, right. I think it's a great idea, but I don't know if it's going to succeed. I'm certainly not going to try and copy you, mm-hmm. but he had to be out there meeting people and engaging people and getting investment and people to be excited about it so they could buy the car or work on the car. So I completely agree. There's a lot to that. And it's interesting that you talk about, perseverance versus perseverating, because that is what we were talking about organizations struggle with, your strategic agility versus your strategic plan.
Right.
You also said something interesting, which is that there's an optimal zone, and we're at the last question. This has been fascinating, and it feels like time has really flown by, but I have one last question, and it sort of touches on the theme that you brought up, where there's an optimal zone for everybody to be in, but on the other hand, the people aren't identical. So the Leo Tolstoy's novel, Anna Karenina, mm-hmm. begins with this passage. Happy families are all alike, and every unhappy family is unhappy in its own way. So my question is there only one way for an organization to be healthy, or is there room for variety in there?
Yeah, I think there's room for variety, but I think they hold some core principles that are very similar.
And what are the core principles that you'd like them all to see?
I would love to see focus. Do they know where they're going? Do they have a good sense of, because that's inherent to the human brain. Like we are more likely to come along and more likely to be motivated and more likely to join in if we know where we're going. So I think there has to be the focus there. And then I would say the other core component is the community that you build within that organization. People go to work for a mission, but they quit because of their leader or because of the culture is toxic. And so we really have to think about what kind of culture do we want to create to get the results that we want. And, again, businesses are there to get business outcomes. I don't have any issues with that. And I think, but I think that we can do both. Like, how can we get business outcomes and create the conditions where people feel like they have a sense of community and that they feel psychologically safe?
So I love that. And forgive me, I'm going to have one extra question.
Yeah, go right ahead.
Because, when you work in a large organization, there's two ways that they put together their mission statement, right? One is, this is what we're doing. It's the focal point and everything else is subordinate to that. Or they ask everybody what the mission should be. And it gets sort of built up of Lego of everything you're already doing.
Yeah.
And so you wind up with like this 17 pillars of excellence. Mm-hmm. Do you see that happening a lot? And do you steer people away from that? Or do you embrace that as being feasible? How do you handle that?
Yeah, no, I steer people away from that, because if we have 17 pillars, that's not a focus. That's like a compilation of a bunch of things. I would say we need to make sure that we have a strong focus and we know where we're going. But part of that focus comes from getting input from everybody in your organization, externally from your customers. So it should be informed from all of the stakeholders that your organization holds. And if it's not, then I would say then you probably have the wrong strategy or you're not headed in the right direction. So in some ways, yes, it comes from that, but it should come from customers and other stakeholders as well as our employees. But if we have 17 pillar, I can tell you 17 pillar, the brain can't remember that. It's going to feel unfocused. And I see that all the time. We have 17 and I'm like, yeah, you can't do that. Humans don't work like that.
Yeah, I feel that way as well. This has been terrific. Thank you so much, Kerry, for joining me on the show.
Yeah, you're so welcome, Tim. Thanks for having me.
My guest today was Kerry Goyette. Kerry's LinkedIn profile and information on where to get her book, The Non-Obvious Guide to Emotional Intelligence, will be in the show notes. My name is Tim Hampton, and you can reach me at tim@unusuallywellinformed.com. Thanks for listening. I hope you will subscribe and join me for the next show with another unusually well-informed leader in business and technology.
Thank you for listening to the Unusually Well-Informed podcast.
The opinions expressed by the host and guests on the Unusually Well-Informed podcast are their own and do not reflect that of their employer or any other affiliation.